G'day, it's Paul Rowe, and this is July 2023 and it's NAIDOC week. And I thought I'd bring you into my own little space here. This is our storytelling centre, which we've just begun here in Dubbo, where I live, and use it today to tell the story of these men in particular. You can see Bill Ferguson over on the left and Bill Cooper up there on the right, and the story of what they thought would be a day of hope. And I want to tell you a sort of a lost story that underpins NAIDOC week, which is pretty much lost now. You don't hear much about it, but you'll be surprised to realise how many Christian men and women, brave Christian men and women, contributed to the beginnings of Aborigines Sunday, as Bill Cooper called it, or what morphed into NAIDOC week. It goes a long way back, actually. I've been reading some of these books here, John Harris's One Blood, and this book here about Bill Ferguson. And what I've realised is that it begins back in the mid-Atlantic, would you believe, on a slave ship. Captain John Matthews was bringing black Africans to the Caribbean to be used as slaves there in the mid-19th century. A terrible trade. And you might remember that William Wilberforce and his group of Christian evangelicals were fighting to change that, one of the great battles of the 19th century. John Matthews is out in mid-ocean, sees a vision, and somehow or another it impacted sufficiently on him to realise he had to change his ways, and so he gave away the slave trade when he got home to Cornwall and became a Wesleyan Methodist, and a pretty strict one at that. He eventually sailed to Australia, went to Ballarat, did quite well, and then brought his two sons, Matthew and Daniel, to live with him, and then they moved up to Echuca around the middle of the 19th century and did quite well there in business, setting up a store there at the port of Echuca on the Murray. One of the things that had affected him, obviously, when he saw what was happening to the black Africans, it obviously changed his heart, and his sons caught it. And so if you go on my website, you'll see the story of Daniel and Janet Matthews and the mission they set up there at Maloga near Echuca. And you'll see some of his story, some of Doug Nichols, who was one of the children trained there. Bill Ferguson was one of the young men trained there by another man, and that's another story I've told, Thomas Shadrach James, a Mauritian Indian, a Christian, who decided he was going to train those young men and women to stand up for themselves, for their own rights. And that was sort of the incubator for the civil rights movement in Australia. Along with Bill Ferguson here in Dubbo, those men became the core who stood up on Australia Day 1938 and declared a day of mourning, not because they wanted that to be happening every year, but over against the 150th celebration of the white men's arrival here. They wanted to make a statement to say, well, actually, for the black people of Australia, it hasn't been a great thing to celebrate, and there's lots that needs to change. We're not even recognised in our own country, and fair enough. They had a protest in Sydney led by Bill Ferguson, and that became a very famous date in terms of the civil rights movement in Australia, the first public demonstration in Australia. And so in that sense, though they predated Martin Luther King in America by 20 years or more, with their determination to stand up as Christian men for their people, because Bill Ferguson was a Presbyterian elder here in Dubbo, and William Cooper became a Christian down there on the little mission at Maloga, begun by Daniel Matthews, who had a passion to stand up for the rights of the Aboriginal people and to urge them to stand up for themselves, along with Thomas Shadrach James. So it was quite an incubator. Now, one of the interesting things that I learned was that during that time, about the 1880s, a black American choir came to Australia. They were university students from a university for black Americans set up after the Civil War to give them a chance to be educated. And so this group was travelling the world raising money for their university. So you see all this dots beginning to connect, and they actually visited Maloga, the mission down there at Echuca, and sang particularly the Negro spirituals, as we call them, or the black freedom spirituals that rose out of the biblical story, particularly the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt to freedom. And it caught the imagination of the people in Maloga, so much so they wept when they heard these songs. They said, that's our story. And they actually turned one of those songs into their own language, the Yorta Yorta language, which is still exists. It's a Yorta Yorta hymn, or spiritual, if you like. And it became part of the culture there at Cummeragunga, where Bill Cooper and Doug Nichols and some of the other leaders were being trained and beginning to voice their protest about what was happening to their people in Australia. Well, I like the fact that when Bill Cooper travelled, and he was a Christian man, on behalf of his people, he took a quartet with him who used to sing songs. A lot of them were hymns. And he said when people began to criticise the missionaries, he said, no, I won't criticise the missionaries. They've been my friends. The Matthews family have been my friends, and other missionaries. So he wasn't anti-missionary. He saw them as people who stood with him. So in the background of him standing up in 1938, and I've got this book here called Thinking Black, and it's got his speeches in it. And you can see it's by Bain Atwood and Andrew Marcus there. And this is what he said. He wrote a letter to the government saying, we're going to have this day of mourning. And then he put a challenge to the Christian churches of Australia, which we still need to hear. This is what he said. We now ask all Christian denominations to observe on Sunday the 23rd of January as Aborigines Day. We request that sermons be preached on this day dealing with the Aboriginal people and their need of the gospel and response to it. And we ask that special prayer be invoked for all missionary and other effort for the uplift of the dark people. That was just prior to the day of mourning. And that was, I think, the beginnings of what we call NAIDOC Week now, but it was Bill Cooper who stood up and said, I want the Christian world to stand with us. And he hoped, and that's why it's got on the top there, a day of hope. He and Bill Ferguson were hoping that the day of mourning would trigger a wave of support from the Christian church as well. A small thing happened. The Baptist church here in Dubbo, the Baptist preacher stood with Bill Ferguson down on Talbragar Reserve in 1938 and preached there at their meeting. And down in Sydney, the first Aborigines Sunday was in 1941, and Archdeacon Hammond, the famous social reformer of the early part of the 19th century, the 20th century, was there, and he gave considerable weight to it. And they heard Pearl Gibbs, who's, if you go into downtown in Dubbo, you'll see her face on a mural on the wall there. She spoke very strongly about what was happening to Aboriginal girls who were being used as, domestic labour, but also sort of prostituted, really. And so it stirred Archdeacon Hammond to stand up for the Aboriginal people too. So there was a move from the churches to sort of stand with the Aboriginal people on those days. But the war intervened, and by 1950, the impetus had drained away. Bill Cooper had died, sadly, in 1941, and as it said on the board here, and this has an echo of Martin Luther King's famous speech about I've been to the mountaintop just the night before he died. Well, Bill Cooper said something similar. Sometimes I get very discouraged at the slow progress we've suffered. God knows. But surely our day of deliverance is drawing nigh. I hope that I live to see it. Well, he didn't. And neither did Bill Ferguson. A few years later in 1950, to all people of Aboriginal blood, I say, I'm fighting for your freedom. And both men died disillusioned. Historian John Harris, in his book One Blood that I've got down here, he saw it as a missed opportunity for the church. Cooper and Ferguson were both strong Christians, he says, to the end of their lives. Not only had the political parties failed them, the institutional churches had also failed them. Great Christians like Archdeacon John Needham were constant support, as were many other individual Christians, but the churches were not yet sufficiently convicted to speak out on their behalf. Both Cooper and Ferguson had believed that they were speaking to an essentially Christian white community, which would recognise that their claims were just and right in a decidedly Christian sense. In this, they were wrong. Well, even though Bill Ferguson and Bill Cooper died disillusioned, 20 years later, in 1967, the referendum resoundingly gave the Aboriginal people recognition, and a lot of things have changed since then. But nevertheless, Bill Cooper's voice, to preach the gospel to his people, please preach the gospel, please pray for my people, that challenge still remains, and not only for the Indigenous people, but for all the new immigrants, for a present Australia who's drifting away and doesn't know the gospel. So it's a challenge, isn't it, to teach them, to pray for them. So I pray that the voice of Bill Cooper and Bill Ferguson and these Christian men and women, the Matthews, speak to us from the past and challenge us in our day to do what we know is the right thing for all Australians. I'm Paul Rowe, the Outback Historian.